Good morning.
Morning.
It is Thursday, May 8th. Week is flying by. And we are continuing our work on S-127. Heard an enormous amount of testimony yesterday. We've walked through the bill. We walked through some ideas for amendments. And I asked everyone to think overnight and wanted to have an open committee discussion about what folks might want to add to the bill, take away from the bill. I believe the word is amend. I don't have to add extra modifiers to it. So can do an open discussion with people raising their hands, or we can go around the table. Anyone have a preference on which mode? Yeah,
Want me to start?
sure. Go for it.
Not that I
We
want.
can go clockwise. We can go clockwise from there, Marty. How's that sound?
That's fine.
Okay.
From my perspective, again, you said we've had a lot of testimony and we have, but it's been a lot to get my head around in just 2 days. Last night I talked to, the chair of the Commerce Committee. I've talked to one of the chairs of the Rural Caucus. I've talked with a number of people, but I just think what we're proposing really mucks things up from what I've heard. And I don't know as though I've got an answer to all of it. I mean, I did write down some of my major concerns. One is including the word in perpetuity. That's a big one for a number of the people that I've talked to. The other issue looks like the but-for test. I mean, it's all spelled out in what our latest draft changes were, but my understanding is the VPIC board already has to do that. And why is that in there?
Pepsi?
Pepsi, yes.
They already have to do that for TIF. They don't have to do it for this unless we put it in statute.
Okay, I think so. Yep. That clears that up then. I guess, I noticed that the auditor had put in a provision limiting the amount used out of the ed fund to 2 cents rather than our total amount of maybe as much as 14 cents over the life of the proposal. You want me to go to that, his comments on that particular piece?
Recall him saying that. I mean, I don't recall him in his written.
Oh, is it the attachment to the
It
email?
was in what he sent us yesterday in an email.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, I can wait to find out again and go over that.
No. Yes. And so are you thinking that makes more sense or less sense?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard from
Yeah.
both people that what we proposed is more realistic as far as, the amount of work that is gonna get done rather than, a 2 cent cap. Let me just go to that, see if I can find it again.
We can come back to you too.
Why don't you do that?
Okay.
And I'll find out just where it was, and go from there. But, I guess maybe the only other thing is in the rulemaking section when it talks about a copy of the draft rules will go to JFO for review. I mean, I don't know if that's kind of typical or not. That's what had been added.
Yeah.
And anyway, I guess the final thing is sunsetting the TIF program and working it all into CHIPS. Again, I've had a number of people tell me that that's a concern because there's such different proposals. CHIPS is looking at, housing and infrastructure, and the TIFs are more broad. Anyway, that's, again, I don't have any real answers. I just have a lot of questions and concerns still.
Great. And just to answer your question about the JFC check back,
Yeah,
it's not usual, but we have done it before. We did it for DCR.
CRRP, Community Reinvestment and Recovery.
Thank you.
Program.
And what's the real reason for it? I mean, again, if they've developed it as rules.
It's just like we're delegating a lot of rulemaking and to make sure that the rulemaking is sort of in line with intent. And I sort of talked to the VEPC director offline about it, and she said she thought it would be fine, but we could definitely go deeper on that.
And I found the section.
Oh, good.
So it looks like he's talking about 1910B. VEPC may only consider applications submitted on or before December 31st. Looks like he's got a recommendation, the sunset trigger should be a no more than amount of impact on the education fund. For instance, it could be a 2-cent impact on the statewide property tax rate. So am I referencing the same position that we had with having $190 million, which is,
So I think he's
Oh.
saying sunsetting at an amount that you hit the cap instead of setting a cap and adding a date sunset. Is that how other people are experiencing? John is nodding.
I am.
So it just sort of sunsets when you hit the cap rather than having a date certain for the sunset.
see,
An interesting idea.
I'm fine.
Cool. Let's go clockwise, and folks are welcome to pass and then talk again, but just so we're not all. So you're welcome to say something and you're also welcome to not. But we're looking for tangible suggestions. Yep, you don't have to raise your hand. You're next up, Jim.
Acknowledge having been in a school board meeting last night and, so I'm listening to everybody's comments around the room. That's about the best I can do.
Alright, thanks.
So my concern for a long time has been the ed fund, and I talked to the governor. He pointed out to me that this CHIP may end up being the only thing we do on housing.
Mhm.
So he was quite eager to get it approved and didn't know where other money would come from. I talked with him briefly at that point about allocating some of the money from purchase and use or sales tax to this program and include current use and other programs that dip into the ed fund if they come along. Carol and I had discussed that a couple of times. The governor wasn't all that thrilled about it and thought the easiest thing might just be to not specify, just do what needs to be done. And that way we'd be ensuring the housing, which I guess I have to give that the housing is more important than protecting the ed fund. I mean, we can do some more manipulating with the ed fund. That's one of the reasons it's attractive to people, but we can do other things, and housing, we don't have that flexibility. Housing, I mean, just needs to be built, period. We've got to do something about housing.
Would a cap make you feel more comfortable using the education fund?
Yes, it would.
See a clarifying question about what somebody said.
Yeah.
Are you saying the governor is saying that housing is more important than the ed fund property taxes?
Yes.
Interesting.
When you think of what's good for Vermonters.
I'm just intrigued, but that's interesting.
Bridget, you're next.
I spent a long time thinking about the cap last night. As it's drafted, this whole idea of capping the amount of increment by county just doesn't quite make sense to me. And I feel like it's going to be a real challenge, as I said yesterday, in the development of projects and getting them to BEPC and really having them be able to rely on this as a source of their capital stack. I'm not necessarily opposed to a cap, but I just feel like this one would make it very complicated and would make it a tool that people would be less likely to use. And I feel like we really do want a tool that people are going to use. But I started to think about caps that might rely on, I think it was more, who was talking about the number of units being mapped down to the municipality level that are targeted for additional housing, like thinking about those targets and perhaps a portion of those being, eligible for, whoever gets there first to use CHIP, if we want to think about a limit. I have to say, I felt like the testimony of the last couple of days has been very compelling that we're just not getting housing built and it's slowing down further and further. And yes, this has an impact on the ed fund, but I feel like even that 30% that the ed fund would be getting from new development is not going to get there if we don't have some kind of tool to help incentivize more housing. So I'm leaning further away from restricted caps and more toward making this a tool, especially in rural areas, that can be available to really help with infrastructure, because I don't think there are a lot of tools to get infrastructure built in rural areas and really get housing going there.
Can I ask you a clarifying question about that? So, in what, like, I want to be clear that what Sean put forward was a brainstorm, start a conversation, but in doing a county by county cap, the idea was that when we don't do that, usually the more rural counties lose, right?
Yeah.
And so if there was sort of a statewide cap, how might we ensure that like the first out of the gate sort of Chittenden County development doesn't suck up the whole
Yeah.
increment?
And I don't
And
think I
is
was
it like,
yeah.
would you do like project prioritization at the VEPC level to make sure that there's county coverage, something like that?
So in my mind, it was more, each county would have a sort of target set, because I think there already are targets that are out there. And there would be priorities within counties, so that you're not having just a statewide, this is how many units are eligible for CHIP, but it would be county by county, so that we're not sort of just saying all development is eligible for CHIP, but that it could be a higher percentage is eligible for CHIP in a specific county that really is needing housing more, or having more trouble meeting their housing goals. That was, again, just brainstorm, but I was just struggling to sort of see I understand the math and how the draft that's in here was brainstormed, but it just, to me, the logic didn't hold up for me about why we were setting that specific cap. And it seemed, again, if you just look at the numbers on the face of them, again, it's a lot of dollars toward Chittenden County and not as many toward rural areas, and just trying to think about if we're gonna have a cap, making sure that the rural areas are prioritized versus folks that have already had an opportunity for CHIP. And I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with TIF being sunsetted. That's the only thing.
I have a few things, but I'll reserve some of them. I'm not comfortable with the but-for. In my time on BEPC, I would say that the but-for is unauditable, and that it's very subjective. So I would just say, take that out, and because we need housing anyway. The second thing is I'm concerned about the stand-up of an existing board for an appeal in case the first application gets denied. And perhaps we don't set up that board, but it's part of TIF right now is that the regional planning commissions and the municipality have to write letters of support saying this is in line with our regional plan and that kind of stuff that gets submitted. So it could be input from one of those housing organizations. Depends on who we designate to say that it is in line with what we need for housing in our area, our district. I would much prefer that rather than setting up another board. So I think there is something to be said for the limitation of improvements to infrastructure. So that's in all of the allowable uses of TIF increment financing. It would make the most sense just to limit it to infrastructure. I'll stop with that because my list is much longer.
Tier 2. I think Tier 2 takes the rural right out of this whole program.
Mhm.
And I think we need to keep that in place.
I share Charlie's concerns about standing up the CHIP board. I just think it's an unnecessary step, and I think that there can be a different way to approach that. I've also thought of the idea of setting a threshold for the gross floor area for housing that we've been talking about. Right now, it's 70%. If it's less than that, they'd have to go to the CHIP board. I would say bump it down to 50% and have that be a hard stop. If this program is supposed to be incentivizing the development of housing units, that's why we're doing this. If your development is not primarily housing units. I just don't think this is a tool that we should be used, that we've heard that there are other programs to help other types of development. So I think that if this is truly for housing, hard 50% floor. Because I just think that's what we're trying to do here. And I don't want, if you're not a majority housing development, I don't think this is the right tool for you.
Can I clarifying 50% is not a majority?
51%. 50% plus one.
Just to be mathy. Okay, thank you.
But-
Okay, yes, okay.
50% plus one elections. Then I also share the tier two concern. I've also heard some advocates have told me that there is still a way for places that aren't tier one or B to do some development. So that's just something I need to learn more about. And also that we don't have tier two maps yet is something that I've heard, and
That is true.
that is just like, I absolutely want the rural communities to take advantage of this, but saying tier two can do it when we just don't know what tier two is yet, I have concerns about. I've thought about perhaps, right now the language says that the development would be within a half mile of existing settlement. Perhaps we make that, a half mile seems really short to me. So perhaps making that larger.
I think that matches an existing definition in
I
statute, or does it-
don't know that the within 1/2 mile does.
Okay,
I think it was just to make sure that you're capturing areas around.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
181, was it not?
I can check.
And what's your name, sir?
Sorry, I am John Gray. Still the opposite person.
To Teddy's point, just while we're on this, my understanding is tier one B still hasn't even been developed yet completely either. Is that correct?
I don't know, let's get some testimony on the tiers.
Yeah, that'd be
Yeah.
great.
I was, the chair of natural resources was gonna come in 2 days ago to give testimony on, like, to talk about how the tiers fit into this, and it all felt preemptive, and now it's a little post-emptive, but I'll ask someone to come in and do it.
I like post them doing
Yeah,
it.
can we find Ellen, if possible at all, for sure? For this morning, or whenever today? Thank you.
And my last one was the requirement to have permitting done before we even get to that. Just like having been on the city council for 6 years and seeing us, we've been decently successful getting some housing development going. But this just all takes so long, and there's so much uncertainty between like, well, like, should we try to get this program before we go for the permits? And it's very daunting for developers. And, you know, city councils, especially select boards in smaller towns, have to go through all that work. So I don't necessarily know what the right answer is there, whether it's these permits and not these others, or however we make that work, but that's another concern that I have. And that's it.
Sure.
Can I clarify something on this front? This may be completely consistent with what you're describing. Permits are required only to access the proviso. If you don't have permits in hand, you have available any of the location criteria. Basically, if you have permits in hand, you don't have to meet location criteria. That's the way to think about it.
Okay.
So you can apply.
That's a helpful clarification.
Meaning that you don't need that bullet point up there anymore, once that's clarified?
Let's keep it there.
Okay, let's add a little.
Easier to erase it than to rewrite it.
And
Yeah.
the 1/2 mile concept, just to the question, is that same kind of concept was in Act 181 around designated centers.
Okay, thanks. If folks, as you speak, can note what Charlie is writing about what you said to make sure it represents your thoughts, that would be awesome. I can't.
And it's neither positive nor negative, it's just, there it is.
Yes, neutrally reflect your thoughts. Thank you.
I have a couple of places in the statute, ask us to go through it, where you think that you'd like us to make comments. Do you want those now? No.
Sure, yeah.
Well, then, in section 19A, indebtedness, when we assess the grand list value for purposes of original taxable value, we might want to have it be a date that is beneficial for the ed fund. Like, you have a piece of blighted property, you're going to have to be making improvements on it. It's known by the time all this process goes through. Now the value of that property is probably considered higher. So you could say you want to assess that on a particular day that's later than the first day. And that would give you more money for the original taxable value for the grand list for the ed fund.
Mhm.
Okay. Then the second one is 1910 CE, page 58.
You know, Samantha had her whole list of like how the value grows over time. I think what Carol's saying is you pick a different point on that list as opposed to the very first day, set original taxable value. So perhaps if it's a brownfield, like perhaps you've cleaned up some of the soils or something like at some.
There may be
later point in the
process, a different day that you want to choose than that day. Just look at it.
Because it would
If
set
we
the
have
original
time to
taxable
look
value.
at that, that is a good thing to look at.
Okay.
All right. The second thing is just thinking creatively here for the section 1910 CE. It says during the 10th year following the creation of a housing development site, you tell BEPC, you update things. And if VPIC thinks you're getting too much increment, they can lower it. I wonder if there was a floor discussed. And then what if the developer, first question was, oh, what if the developer forced to repay quickly? Then I thought, because if you repay, once you repay, when does the,
Can you back up and start again?
all right, so you have to, if you're fulfilling the purpose that it's housing, it's low income, let's say. And so when your bond is done, or when 10 years are up, now you can do what you want, 20. It says 10 years for some reason. Anyway, at 20 years, then you can do, it doesn't have to be low income. It's not limited to affordable housing anymore. So my question is, if a developer decided, well, you know what, I'm going to repay that right now.
Mm-hmm.
No more increment goes to the ed fund then gets the full value of the property on the grand list. But then the developer has had all the benefit of the build out of the water and sewer and whatever else. And then can turn the housing into market rate stuff. So it gets around the purpose.
Can you clarify? I feel like you clarified that for me or for Carol. I have a vague memory.
Not for me.
So there are a few different things we're talking about in the same conversation that I think are separate strands, that are.
That
separate.
sounds like me.
So the 10-year check-in is about downward amending the percentage of retention.
Mhm.
Basically saying, if you're adequately financing your project with the increments you've been receiving, and we can see this across of those 10 years, we see that you don't need the full amount, we can drop that percentage to protect the ed fund. And that's basically the point of that. And there is a floor set for that, because what it says is that it still has to provide sufficient funding to cover the cost of financing. So there's a floor set to how much they can lower it.
Right.
There's a,
Listen.
I'm not sure I fully understand the second piece related to that. I think you're asking, can folks circumvent the purposes of the program by just outright paying up front? And I think the answer is maybe, but we don't know empirically if anyone's likely to have that much cash on hand to do it. And in any event, BEPC has approved the financing plan, which would spell out how they are doing this. So that's the best answer that I have on that front. I don't know that empirically we're running into developers who have $1 million on
So
hand.
what,
Yeah.
now you're talking about a developer now, expand the scope to anywhere in the country. A private equity firm decides, there's money to be made here, there's housing units there, 3,000 housing units there. And they're affordable and low income, inclusionary and all these other things. But if I put money to set aside that debt and then turn that into market rate, I can make a lot of money.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's what
So-
I want to prevent.
Yeah, sure. So the answer I have there is it would, with the current affordable housing construct, the requirement there is that you have covenants of a particular duration. So the covenants would be built into the units that are being sold, right? So even if they deplete, even if they resolve, like they get out of the program because they paid off, they no longer have access to the increment because they paid off the full funds, the site has been retired, the debt has been retired.
Okay.
Those covenants are built
Covenant
into
runs
the
with the
contractual agreement, so I think that's the.
That answers.
And what I also hear you saying, Representative Odie, is that if we change the way affordability covenants are designed in the bill, you want to make sure we're protecting against that
Ooh, absolutely.
scenario. Okay, thank you. Okay, anything else?
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Other things you can put on.
Okay, and we're gonna go around a few times. Some people say
Oh, good.
future ideas,
So
so.
regarding the chipboard, I'm glad we're going.
Yeah.
Regarding the chipboard comments.
We need another whiteboard.
I know.
Where's the news?
So I feel that we need to, look, we need, if it's not majority housing, you said, then we don't need that board. But I have to think about the story, tell a story, because stories are what I remember. Kodak was thinking, well, we're gonna expand our footprint, and we want to build a factory in upstate New York, like upstate Western New York, I can't remember which town, they're there now. It's not business anymore. And they had to, what would they do? Well, they needed housing and they needed
Rochester.
it was Rochester, thank you. And they needed housing, but they needed people to go, right? So they had to have housing, but you know what they built first? Yeah, infrastructure. They built theater, hospital, etc. So we can build houses, and CHIP is helpful for that, but we need CHIP for infrastructure for the stuff that is cultural, that makes people want to move to a place.
So what are you asking for in the bill?
Not to get rid of TIF, no.
Okay, thank you.
And then, and if anything, I would say to expand it. It's not right that Rutland can't go for another TIF. Rutland is being saved by a TIF right now with the hotel. Okay, next thing. I don't think that we should have a cap. We're imposing a cap before we even see what's going on. We have this process. There's a check-in by Betsy in January. The Ed Fund is getting, all right, check-in in January. So to me, I think we're operating from a scarcity viewpoint. And I think we should start this and see how it goes. And I want to say, I still have to, I'm sure there's an explanation, but somehow I'm missing. The Ed Fund is hurt when it gets the original taxable value plus 30%. They're getting the original taxable value. That's life today. They keep getting it all the way through the 20 years. That may be all they had gotten, because this thing, the houses aren't being built. They haven't been being built and been.
I'm gonna try to.
built.
Can I?
So, no.
Okay.
So there's this original taxable value. They're in addition going to get the 30% of the increment. And now it's just this 70% that they've got to give up to get housing in their town, which hopefully will mean jobs can stay here instead of when a company has to put its higher income paying jobs in South Carolina because on logic, because there's no housing for them here. And we'll get more kids in schools, et cetera. So, and demographically, it'll be better, so forth. That's what I'm saying. So tell me if I'm missing something.
So what I said, that might have only been yesterday. Maybe it was the day before. Sort of moving out of the binary of this hurts the Ed Fund, this helps the Ed Fund, and into the idea that if we make this a totally fully open program, then development that would have happened regardless, that increment will go to the developers rather than going to the Ed Fund naturally. So if we assume that there is some grant list growth regardless of state action or because of previous state action, then, and we make this program broad enough, all development will get sucked into it. And so that's sort of the maximum exposure I'm worried about. I'm not talking about each individual, very particularly crafted project that has been shown to us to desperately need this program. I'm talking about what happens if it is wide open and happens writ large.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
And not binary. What if we said, here's the grand list that we expect historically, we expect it to be 14%, is it? And whatever that would generate to the Ed Fund, we go into the general fund and we scoop that out of meals and rooms and takes that percentage more into the Ed Fund. Just saying, it's all a construct. It's all, this is why you have got two house appropriations. But the thing is, it's all a construct anyway.
It is all a construct anyway. Thank you. Okay. Onwards.
And I'll follow that.
Yeah.
And I came from the same board meeting last night where we were told by a school board that was advised by its council that if our education plan goes into effect, they'll have to cut 4 million out of their elementary school to stay level on their taxes. And that's almost their entire budget. They're hyper anxious about property tax increases. And I feel like JFO has told us 6 ways Sunday that this is going to raise property taxes for people's state funds. So I am carrying that into this conversation. And I'm trying not to be a binary because we do need infrastructure for housing. So things that make it easy for me. I think we have to have a cap. We have to have a cap. And I would just point out that we spent 120 million of one-time money to buy down tax rates, setting us up for a cliff in fiscal year 27. If we'd spent that out at 1 cent, we would have had 8.5 years of 14 million investment to put into the ed fund to fund this program. I wish we'd done that. We didn't. So let's figure out how to get comparable work for them. I think we can try. I'm so grateful to you for your comments. I also would like,
Before you jump on to the next one, the cap that I put on the table, do you like that cap? Is there a different cap that feels like a better cap?
I had a long conversation with Representative Kimball, who obviously would like more. The power of a 1 cent cap is it's tangible and it also grows. If this genuinely does create growth, then there will be more money available for infrastructure, but it sort of makes it prove itself. So I'm trying to find a way to compromise.
Cool, thank you.
So we'll figure it out.
And after Representative Feltus speaks, I'm going to ask Julia to come sit in the chair for a moment and describe what a 1 cent cap would look like. So,
And maybe she will tell us something much smarter that we haven't thought about, which is what Julia intends to do. I would also love to see us exclude contiguous parcels that are not being developed from the retention. So we're not rewarding people for parcels that they aren't developing, if that makes sense.
can you describe it a little more physically?
If within the project area, there are parcels that are being developed for housing, fantastic. If within the parcel, there's a lot of land that is not being developed, that is being served by the investment, I don't think that should be counted for purposes of development, particularly because we come from an area where there's huge property growth.
So that would be a big difference between TIF and this, right?
Yes.
That's what we do in
Yeah.
TIF, and that way, if you want that, you go for
Yeah.
TIF, and if you don't want that, you go for DIF.
Right.
Okay.
Something like that.
Great.
Yeah, and this is for real, and this to Representative from Barry's point of view, this is about housing. And in that vein,
Asking.
asking you.
We're going with it.
I wasn't gonna work that hard.
Maybe over by the Macon? What do you have to share?
Ways and Means.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. And then Mark was-
I will wait.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, wait.
It cannot touch the
You take
paint.
the
You can't lean against the.
No, not
Stand it up.
Just.
Yeah, you can't lean on the
paint.
paint. You have to move the paint.
Look at that.
We solved the problem together.
Don't worry, Molly. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you, Molly.
Hey, Molly.
It's just longer.
Oh, it's so nice. Oh, you're so proud. Whoa. So proud.
No, it's the windows create a vacuum. It is not anyone.
Comment from the speaker's assistant.
Oh, that could go down quite a bang.
Okay, thank
Higley
you.
was the last one was in.
Okay, let's all go back. Thank you. And
I really appreciate what Representative Kimball said about limiting it to public infrastructure. I do not think tax dollars should be used to improve private properties. So I appreciate that. That said, but that's what we're currently approving. And with that, if this is truly about housing, I don't have a problem saying it has to be used as a primary residence, either because it's a long-term renter or someone who's filing a homestead declaration, because my concern is we are building Airbnbs or investment properties. This is housing for Vermonters. I'd like us to make sure it do needs to actually house.
and that's already in the,
Right.
do you like the version in the amendment, the version in the bill? They're slightly differently phrased, but it's in both of them.
I'll go back and review.
Okay.
Primary residence, that's the in perpetuity.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
And then the other two other pieces, one, we have not much cash as a state. We've got some pretty big problems. And I'm concerned with making sure we get the biggest bang for our buck. When I talk to a lot of people, they've got hour-and-a-half long commutes each way, hour-long commutes. I'm not I excuse the legislators who do that because you have a reason to do that, but people don't want to actually live very far from where they work because it's expensive to pay for your gas. It's also a climate problem if you really care about emissions. So I would encourage us to at least add as one of the criteria, proximity to job density. That one of the things when we're approving this project is we consider, prioritizing if there's finite resources, places that get people out of car. And I realize that's unpopular, but I would encourage us to consider it. With respect to the Community Housing and Infrastructure Board, I don't know what the answer is here. I do have concerns about BEPC because I do have concerns about an entity being responsible both for promoting and regulating. I think that's inherently problematic, which is why I'm open to the idea of a CHIP board that makes decisions about approval, in which case it actually can't report to BEPC. It would have to be the other way around. So I'm open to considering a CHIP board that approves applications for these infrastructure projects. If we do that, that is a board that needs more experience with housing than is currently on that membership. So I would encourage replacing some of the people. I mean, I don't think this is Viva's wheelhouse. It certainly is VHCB's wheelhouse, and they're not on the board. Having worked extensively with initiatives like this in other arenas, I think it's inherently problematic to have the people who either represent the people receiving the benefit or the grant or actually receiving it themselves being part of distributing it. So I would recommend that we take the LCT off because I think it's a conflict of interest for them to be on the board, and maybe putting somebody who has experience again with housing. There are other possible candidates. And I think we should have someone who's appointed by the VSBA who is there just to be able to communicate about the impact on property taxes.
Rebecca's speaking very quickly as everyone caught up to her brain. Okay.
Because these are really just things that I needed slowly.
Sorry. You do know that there's research that if you speak quickly, people pay more attention than if you speak quickly.
Pay attention or process as a fast talker. There's paying attention, then there's actually processing what you say. And
We're
those are
assuming they're
different things.
either way.
Yeah. So I just want to, now that I've interrupted, just want to say, my understand, there is a group of housing organizations in this state that meet regularly to hear early pitches of housing projects for financing. I'm trying to find out what that group is called and if they are official at all, in order to see if maybe there's an existing thing. Chris is on it already. And to see if there is an existing thing that we could use instead of creating a brand new thing. But yes,
Exactly.
yes,
I think that's what it
SBA
is.
where you work.
I think if it's housing, a group that is experienced with housing will know what the success factors are and they'll be able to speak to those.
Yes.
It does not make sense to stack the board with people who don't do that work the same.
Yes.
And I do think VSBA should have a member on the board because they're the ones paying the bill. And the people who pay should have a voice or at least be at the table when decisions are made about how to use the money that they're devolving to their voters. So that, I'm going to stop there because I've talked a lot.
Thanks. Representative Feltes.
Many of the same concerns. I would like to take a look at the listed improvements that are on page 2. There's only a couple there that I think maybe don't really belong to construction of power and telecommunications, simply because they can either be a municipal thing, I understand, or it can be an investor-owned utility, those kinds of things. And so I'm not sure they infrastructure. I would like to beef up the purpose a little bit. There's some language that the auditor suggested that beefed up that purpose language, insisting that it is indeed housing. The but for, I like, although I was playing around with that in terms of the incentives. If we were to change the incentives to make it much lower, then it would not be possible to have a but for, or they wouldn't meet the but for. But if you really want the but for, then that means we would need to have the higher incentives. So that's it.
Can you pause 1 second? I think Charlie missed what you were saying. You said no telecommunications infrastructure on the list. Was there anything else on that list you wanted to?
The definition of the improvements that are on page 2.
Acceptable uses of increment improvements.
Right.
Yeah.
Telecom.
Yeah. The example was telecom or electricity. Because they may be investor-owned utilities, but they may not be. I mean, in my case, the electricity is municipal and the telecommunication is a CUD. So they're both, public in that sense. The retention limits, again, is something that I was considering should perhaps be lower and as opposed to being 70 and 80. The incentive being the 80 if it's the whole affordability, maybe it should be 60 and 70, if that still leaves it as a viable component for the capital stack. I'm wondering about the municipal retention. I mean, 85% is an awful lot. To leave the municipality only 15% extra to take care of whatever their municipal duties may be related to this development. So I'm wondering if we can reduce that a bit. And then when we talk about if we get to a cap or close to a cap, there's a section in there that talks about prioritization of what may be allowed. But there's no indication of what the guidelines might be on that prioritization. Do we want to talk about geographic distribution, or do we want to talk about size of projects, or no indication there?
Do you want to move one of them closer to the other?
No, this is good, it's great.
I'm gonna put the painting behind Saoirse instead. I really love that painting.
And if we have a chip board, depending upon who's on it, I don't think we need to pay them per diems. I think they're gonna be people who are actively involved in the housing industry anyway. I mean, it's a small thing, but, and then I wonder about terminating the tip program. So I don't know enough to make a decision that we should just plain terminate that right away and go to this instead. I think we can utilize to leave tip available as a big district, a much larger district kind of a project in terms of the availability for that kind of program.
One teeny tiny clarification with John is the per diem thing. Is that referencing a statute that they only get the per diem if they need the per diem?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. Salary.
So they wouldn't get it. It just looks like they do because the way the statutes.
I can
Use your
pull up
words,
the-
but
Okay.
okay, great, okay. Are they clarifying questions for Marty? No?
This is my change.
Yeah, no, go on your channel. Yeah, I just wanted to.
It's all very useful. And in terms of working our way through the process of what we're doing here, it seems to me the biggest conflict we have, and I call it a conflict, is housing infrastructure improvement and its, growth versus rates on the ed fund. It's hanging out there. And we're gonna need to just decide where our priorities lie. Because that's, at least for me, that's a fundamental director. And we'll need to sort it out. And in that, we can decide which one of these things, which are all useful. We're gonna prioritize and perhaps solve for X in that order, Not necessarily, but that's a way to approach it.
So this is to kind of counter what Representative Holcomb had talked about as far as approximate to job density. I think that's why it's so critical that tier 2 is included. And I know from my constituency's perspective, they'd much rather live an hour away from Burlington than live in Burlington, or, and I, whether it's, a majority of my folks work at Global Foundries, Ben and Jerry's, Whitcomb, concern. I mean, it's all over the place. I think that would be a limiting factor if we were to use something like approximate to job density, but it's just my perspective.
Thanks. I'm gonna ask Julia to jump into the chair if you're feeling ready for that, Julia.
Feel free to move the chair. If you have any clarification, I think what you said, 85% original bill, maybe on this wall. The original was 100% municipal. Yeah, so at least change it to 85.
Well, definitely, I think the municipality needs to have some wiggle room. If
Okay, yeah.
they're gonna be improving infrastructure in the community, the municipality is gonna have some expenses too.
I'm gonna trust the VLCT would have asked for it to be lower if they wanted it to be lower. But heard. Okay. Julia, hi. Julia's here for an ed fund reset. And then probably this afternoon, Tom Cavet's gonna join us and talk about how he would book something like this. for all the projections he does. So Julia, hi.
Hi,
Thanks for coming over. We've missed you.
yeah, missed all of you. Julie Richter, joined Bristol office. Just full disclosure, I've been working on the yield bill and H 454 in the Senate, so I have not been following your conversation or this bill in the way that I would in other years. So I'm still getting up to speed, but I have been listening to your conversation and talking with Pat and John and Ted offline about this bill and CHIP. And I think, Madam Chair, is there something that you wanted me to speak to specifically? I have a couple of thoughts from listening to the
Why don't
conversation.
you share a couple thoughts from the conversation and then
Okay.
we can ask questions if we have.
So I think in terms of level setting and thinking about grand list value and the education fund, one piece that's important to keep in mind is what does growth in the grand list entail, right? And there's two pieces that we use to measure growth in the grand list year over year, two pieces essentially that are going into the 14% that you're talking about. And that is sticks and bricks, which is literally building of new property, and appreciation. So just values of property increasing. And we need to consider both of these pieces because both of these pieces grow the grand list. When we work in the yield bill every year, and in the education fund, and we're thinking about how much the grand list is growing by, we're thinking about what property values are going to be taxed to raise education fund dollars. So by not booking that appreciation, so to speak, or carving out a piece of that appreciation or sticks and bricks and not using that increase in value for the purpose of education fund property taxes, that means that the rest of the state's grand list is going to need to make up a bigger share of that property taxation. So this gets back to, when we're talking about equalized value versus actual value and the CLAs and reappraisals, it's all part of this conversation that the grand list is growing. And the projection that Pat has been talking about is 14%. That's what we saw last year. So thinking about, for instance, I walked in when you were having a conversation about the but-for argument, right? In all of our modeling, which we do in conjunction with Tom Cavett, we take Tom, I guess you're hearing from him later, but we take projections from Tom Cavett. In that modeling, we are assuming that the grand list is going to continue to grow by the amount that the administration and JFO economists have consensus agreed on, right? So if we were to say that 14% is not going to grow, the grand list is not going to grow by that 14% because a portion of it is growing, but not needing to remit those property taxes to the education fund, then there is less base in the education fund against which property taxes can be applied against, which then means that property taxes will need to go up in the other corners of the state to make up for those pieces that have been carved out.
Clarifying, I heard what you said, but maybe you didn't get in between it. Can you restate less space for growth?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about the grand list,
Great.
and we think about how much needs to be raised for the education fund and property taxes. We have the base, what are we applying the property taxes against, and then the tax rate. Right?
Yep.
Right now, we're talking about the grand list based across the state. If there are pieces that are no longer remitting education fund property taxes to the state because they are being used for the CHIP program or for the TIF program, then those taxes are being held for CHIP or TIF, and they're not going to the state. In which case, there's a smaller base to raise the funds,
Got it.
and so the property taxes need to be higher.
Thank you.
I will just, one more piece of context, is I actually have the yield model up in front of me because I thought there might be specific questions, and I'm just looking at it right here. And I think it's important to note that the underlying modeling that's done for all of the yield bill and all of the property taxes that we do is we take the grand list that has been booked by the Department of Taxes and we grow it by the amount of projection. So I literally am looking here and I have the grand list value. This is the yield model that we work on every week or month. The grand list value growing by appreciation and then growing by sticks and bricks. And that is what we're calculating our yields and our rates against. So the lower that appreciation is, or the lower that sticks and bricks is, the more property taxes will go up in other areas.
I think Charlie had a, yeah, right?
I did, couple of questions, Joe, because there's two pieces of it that I've often argued about when considering TIF. One is that you're not decreasing the grant list. You're just impacting the increase in the grant list, correct?
I'm not the TIF expert. I think that's my understanding of TIF, and my understanding of CHIP is that it is different than TIF. Or there are different considerations.
Yeah, somewhat, but you know, there's two other things. So it's all things being equal. If the education fund expenses did not increase, then you're not necessarily impacting the tax rate by withholding future contributions from a TIF district.
I think it gets back to that counterfactual
Of the but-for.
conversation. I will say that essentially what we do is when we get the grand list, and then we subtract out all of the TIF value, and that's what we're booking here. So the more that is subtracted out, the smaller the base.
The base, assuming that your education expenses have increased, so you have to raise more money from the same grant list. You're just not being able to apply that across all the properties that are otherwise restrained.
Yeah, I think one thought, and I would be interested if my friends who have more subject matter expertise in TIF and CHIP want to chime in after. I think that there's two pieces worth talking about. One is, from my perspective, one is the counterfactual argument, right? If there's no growth in the grand list, then of course, what you're saying is true. If there is some growth in the grand list, that would have happened despite that project that is being withheld from the education fund. Pat, John, anything?
The only thing I think I would offer here is I think you guys, when you use the word smaller relative to something else, you may be talking about two different comparisons. So when you say smaller, you're taking that list you receive and then you're literally subtracting the increment from that. That's agnostic as to whether the growth that created the increment would have or wouldn't have happened in the absence of tax increment financing. So when you say smaller, you're saying smaller relative to that, right? Whereas I think what Representative Kimball is saying is smaller relative to the grand list absent the new project, right? So I think you're just using smaller in different ways, but it does come down to the but-for test. If you think it would have happened without the tax increment financing, you're hurting the ed fund. You're literally drawing the revenues that would have gone to the ed fund. If the project wouldn't have happened, then you have increasing values. Like it's.
And the last question I had, and the other piece, which is always interesting, is did the TIF, creation of the TIF or the CHIP, actually increase in education expenses? And in most TIFs, that would be no. If you look at, and there's no measure of the number of students that you have to educate that are then housed within a TIF. So that's an interesting way to look at it. And even in the CHIP, that's actually the opposite. So-
I mean, I think what increases education expenses or doesn't increase education expenses is very confusing.
Increasing
at
the
this
number of
point.
students that need to be educated.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, Julia.
I think, one piece about the education expenses, I don't know. A reminder is that education expenses are generally step functions, right? So if you have 1 or 2 or 3 more students, it doesn't necessarily increase the cost. It decreases the per pupil cost. It gets to, once you have a certain number of students in a certain cohort, then you may have a step up because you may need to expand into another class. So I don't, that's the only reminder I would say.
I see so many hands. I also know, did you get through everything you wanted to?
But that was one, there was also a discussion of cap and 1 penny, but.
Okay, let's get to it.
Related, but.
I feel like there was someone over here that I moved on to Charlie for. Okay, Representative Burkhart, Wazazak, Holcomb.
I have a math question, which is, you're saying that the ed fund projections assume 14% growth in the grant list, and you said that's kind of broken into the building of new property. So actually sticks and bricks, as you're calling it, and appreciation. What is the breakdown in that between those two things? So for example, VLCT yesterday said that the sticks and bricks part of it, they assumed was 0.8% to 3%, somewhere in that range. What is the assumption when you're working on the ed fund outlook?
It depends on the year because it comes from the consensus forecasts from the economists. The vast bulk of it is appreciation.
Okay.
And Tom Kvet's joining us this afternoon, I think, and he could answer that more precisely. Representative Wozniak?
So that was almost exactly the question I was going to ask, so thank you. And I think that there's also, between TIF and CHIP, in TIF, we're talking about larger districts where you're capturing a good chunk of an entire downtown. Whereas with CHIP, we're talking presumably smaller from a land size perspective, project-based things. So is it not a logical assumption that in CHIP, we would lose, if you accept the framing of this as costing the ed fund money, we would certainly lose a lot of the appreciation growth in a TIF district because it's a large chunk of downtown and there's a lot of appreciation there that we would forfeit if you do a TIF district. But with a CHIP with a smaller land value, is it a safe assumption to say that we are risking less of foregone appreciation revenue?
I, not being a TIF nor a CHIP expert, I would not necessarily agree with that characterization because it depends on all of the other pieces. How many CHIP districts are there going to be? What does it look like? Where are they located?
Without more restrictions or rules, there's no way for you to.
Yes, and if there's not a but for, within TIF, there is a but for. If there is not a but for, then we are essentially saying this growth that would have happened anyways, we cannot tax for the education fund.
Appreciation growth, yes, but sticks and bricks, not necessarily.
Yes, and appreciation is the vast bulk of grand list growth.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Representative Holcomb, Odie and Feltus, or are you not anymore? Okay, Representative Holcomb and then Feltus, and then we'll figure it out.
I really appreciate in other contexts how you've done sort of forward-looking projections. Is there a way you could create an ed fund outlook for fiscal year 27 that starts by projecting forward based on assumptions about appreciation and inflation, and gives us a sense so that we could use that to get an impact of what we're likely looking at, and then what the impact of different, 1 cent cap versus a 2 cent cap would do?
In short, no, because JFO do not forecast education spending and school district budgets.
I'm saying if we held, assuming current spending, but increased by inflation, and we know it's an exercise, but just so people can see the impact of that assumption about 14% growth in the grand list, and assuming our current budgets plus inflation, the yield build from this year and what that's gonna do in fiscal year 27, so that we can look at the impact of various levels of constraining total investment on TIF.
I think after Representative Feltus's question, I think Julia's going to talk us through sort of what a cap scenario would do for sort of a cent on the tax rate. Right? From like, you're talking about a cent on, what's that?
Pat?
Good, Pat, great, okay.
Trying to get up to speed.
Okay, cool, thank you, okay. And we'll see how close that gets to what you're asking, Representative Holcomb.
Okay, this is probably not related to those, but it intrigues me when we talk about current use and you're talking about the appreciation of the grand list. Do you calculate the appreciation of land values and then go back and look at it again with the artificial discounted rate for the current use and then come with a balance? Or how is current use in your calculations of what the grand list is?
That is done annually by PBR,
Mhm.
and they include that in the projections that we use, in the grand list projections that we use for the yield model.
They're
So
already
essentially-
assuming it's been discounted
Yes.
before they give it to you.
Yeah,
Appreciated and then discounted?
the value of the current use property.
Both things happen to it.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's
Yes,
kind of
Representative Bodie.
almost like a reappraisal every year by PBR of the value of each of those properties in current use.
I mean, that's essentially what the equalization study does, right? Is it looks at property values across the state.
Yeah, I just. So the only question I have beyond that is then when there's a reappraisal done within a city, it doesn't raise any more money on the grant list than it had raised. It just changes what your value is vis-a-vis other properties in your city or town. So I guess, how does that minute thing translate to the CLA? That's why you do it by town. Yeah, I got it. I mean, I got it before.
Okay.
Now I really see something I didn't see before. And I also see something I didn't see before by the beginning of your presentation, which is what I've been asking for 4 days.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yay. Julia, tell us about a penny.
So I will want to phone a friend, Pat, because he's been doing more of the nitty gritty work in terms of the cap. So you'll recall that when we talk about a penny on the rate, we're talking about the uniform application of a 1 cent increase to either the homestead rate, the non-homestead rate, or both. Ballpark, that's about 14 million on both the homestead and non-homestead rate, meaning that if there was 1 cent increase to every education property tax rate across the state, that would raise 14 million. If there were a 1 cent decrease uniformly, that would decrease revenues by 14 million. And their non-homestead sits a bit above 7 million and homestead sits around 6.5. So a penny on the non-homestead raises more than a penny on homestead uniformly. And then there's the other caveats that we're aware of income sensitivity and where the rates are increased, but it's the general rule of thumb. With respect to the cap, I know that Pat has done some quick math for that.
Do you want to come? You can, depending on how long you want to talk, you can sit in the other place.
I think, so I have a.
Oh, what's your name?
I'm Patrick Church.
Thank you.
I have joined fiscal office. I have 2 super simple tables that kind of show the cap that we were talking about yesterday and how that sort of spreads out over the course of to make that bigger.
I can do that from here.
That's what's so magical about sitting over there.
I want to focus first on this top table. This is from the language that we were looking at yesterday. You remember the overall cap that we were looking at when we broke it down, planned at 14%, applying it to each county individually, applying the non-homestead rate, what that would look like. So we got to 191 million as the aggregate cap, right? And with this, basically you have the 5 years of the program plus the allowable 20 years of the financing. So if we were to look at what the average annual increment retained per year would be, that comes out to about 7.6 million annually. Of course, that's average annual. It's not to say that it would be the same in every year. And then the second thing, the second table just below it. From what I heard, you all were talking a little bit about capping it based on maybe a penny per year, right? If I'm understanding that right. So this 13.9 billion here, that's the sort of rule of thumb that Julia was just talking about. If you uniformly apply that to the homestead and non-homestead rate, obviously there's some other caveats with the income sensitivity piece there, but for rule of thumb purposes here, over the same program lifespan, capping it at penny per year in aggregate would yield about this much in total increment retention over the lifespan of the program. And again, we've talked about this, but just because there is this cap, you still don't have any way of estimating for you if they're actually going to hit the cap, like if they're going to be below or if there's some demand for above the cap. Again, keep trying to bring this point home. There's this important piece of the but-for consideration here when thinking about, is this going to happen in these locations? Would it have happened elsewhere? I mean, I just keep talking about, we don't know the sort of scope, scale, how many projects we're talking about here. But if we were to assume that everything's going right up to the cap, this is sort of what you would look at sort of in terms of looking at total aggregate cap, the amount of education tax increment that would be retained over the 25-year program lifespan.
Why is it 25 years? I thought it was 20. What are we?
I believe in the amendment, it's coming from 10-year program down to 5, right?
Yeah, so the 25-year is really tied to the financing, right?
Right.
Rather than some other piece. So like the retention period, for example, is up to 20 years, but the retention period isn't necessarily the same timeline as your financing timeline. So this is just tied to expected financing timeline.
Thanks.
The other thing I might offer here is that for effects on education property taxes, what will really matter is what happens in a year. So because these are average, that literally is just dividing, right, that aggregate figure across the number of the years, but it doesn't take a position on when those fall in. And if you don't have some kind of prioritization mechanism, you could have a run on projects that mean, in fact, you're incurring well over the average in one given year, which would have greater effects on your.
And also just the one other way you can potentially look at it is capping the annual,
Right.
as opposed to having an aggregate cap, having a cap on the annual retention.
And so can you translate what's on the screen to the sort of penny on the tax rate conversation?
So that bottom one, that 13.9 million, that would be a one penny increase on both the non-homestead and homestead rate. If that were, to Pat's point and John's point, not an annual cap, but over the lifetime of the program, it could be that it would be multiple cents, multiple pennies in some years and fewer in other years. So we may see some not artificial, but some volatility across tax rates dependent on how much is falling in 1 year or really being held in 1 year.
Representative Feltus.
I'm just keeping in mind for reference that the forecast we received for the TIF districts so far is approximately 6 to 7 million per year in terms of withheld income from the ed fund. So this would be another 7 million as an example.
Representative Wesson.
And I'm also thinking that a way this could be structured to sort of address some of that volatility is when we did the big housing bill the first time. With the, I can't remember whether it was the down payment assistance, one of the grant programs was, you can go up to this much over a 5-year period. And so I think that there could also be some nuance between, all right, over 25 years, we authorize 347 million, and it's up to, VEPSI or whoever how to do that. There's, all right, you can do up to 13.9 on an annual basis. There could be some in between there where we say, okay, over 5 years, you can authorize no more than X amount for an aggregate limit of 347 million over 25 years. But logically, I think that 13.9 million in theory is a price that I would pay for significant increase in housing intensive lot.
Great, thank you. Questions for Julia, and then I'm gonna release Julia from the chair so we can have conversation. Yeah.
Julie, how complicated would it be model? I'm just thinking, it doesn't seem like a super complex thing, but maybe it is. To model how much growth in the sticks and bricks you would need to sort of outpace that appreciation that you're sort of taking out from Ed Fund. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so at some point, if you're growing faster than the, 1 to 3%, that little 30% that you are retaining on the TIF district or the CHIP project, eventually, if you have enough growth under there, that's going to outpace the overall impact of taking out the appreciation that you're taking out when you go to look at how it, do you understand what I'm saying, Jen? I'm not being very articulate, but just where is that sort of break even point in terms of the growth of the sticks and bricks, if you will, to have a positive impact on the Ed Fund as opposed to a negative impact by scooping out assumed appreciation out of that portion.
When you say growth in sticks and bricks, are you talking about outside of the CHIP areas?
No,
And the check.
in the chip, because so my understanding of what you're doing when you say that TIF is taking, when you look at the Ed Fund outlook, TIF is scooping out the appreciation. That's because you're assuming that sort of in the TIF district, the way TIF is structured right now, you're assuming a certain amount of appreciation on that whole area. And then when you tip some of it, if you will, suddenly some of that appreciation goes off to this increment, 70% of it goes off to the increment as opposed to going to the Ed Fund, 30% of it's still going. If there were enough sticks and bricks, if there were enough like underlying appreciation before like the market rate, impact on the CHIP areas and the TIF areas, if there was enough sticks and bricks growth, then the appreciation on that growth should outpace the amount that you're scooping out, if you will, of the assumed growth. Maybe I should write this down. Do you understand what I'm saying? Maybe I should write down because I'm not being very articulate. Like I can see it in my head and maybe I should just write it down and send it to you and see how complicated that would be. Because that's where I'm stuck, is that if we're not incentivizing this growth and the growth is just stagnant, we're not even getting that 30%, and I understand what you're saying is that the Ed Fund outlook is already assuming more than that 30% is coming in through appreciation each year. And we're slowing down the appreciation section as opposed to the sticks and bricks portion.
I think
put more stuff into a TIF district or a CHIP project.
Yeah, I think that one piece, and maybe I was not as explicit as I could have been. When thinking about TIF and thinking about, and I'm saying like pulling that piece away, essentially the only point that I'm making is that that's not part of our base, the 70%, right? So I'm not postulating whether the TIF is helping the education fund in terms of the appreciation of the 30% versus retaining the 70%. I don't know. That would be a question for Ted, who I know is not here right now. I think one of the pieces that I'm trying to wrap my head around is the chip, it really is getting back to, in my mind, the but for argument. Or test of if that appreciation and or sticks and bricks, any growth in the grand list were to happen without the CHIP program, then that's what I'm talking about. It's pulling the part of the base away from the education fund because that growth in the grand list would have happened without the CHIP program.
Yeah.
First, let's clarify that 13,900,000 represents the retained increment.
Mhm.
So in order to get to what I think Representative Burkhardt is asking, you can almost take that divide by 0.7 because it represents the 70% that's retained of the education tax, and then multiply that times the tax rate. And then you look at the amount of the investment required in order to generate enough revenue to make up for the loss. It looks like about 30 million. But the question I think I have is, have you or Pat thought about what that 13.9 million represents in terms of the number of the value of the projects, at least for the infrastructure that is made equals? You know what I mean? And this is just the infrastructure. It's not,
Right.
We're not talking about the total value of the housing that's developed or the properties that are developed. We're just talking about the value of the infrastructure. And it's a lot.
I have not. I don't know if Pat has.
Yeah.
I'm here as your
He's looking at a
ed fund,
spreadsheet. Yeah.
ed fund expert.
Are you asking Julia a question?
Well, I feel as though,
So are you asking Julia a question?
yeah,
Okay, great.
yeah, I
Okay.
feel as though the direction that Representative Burkhardt is going could have an impact that makes sense, then I think it sounds like it does, but and that would that impact the cap that you would put if you were to try to cap? I mean, would you say it opens up more room for more chip because it's a less burden on ed? Is that where you were going? It's less increment overall.
So we're going questions for Julia, and then I'm gonna have her
Well, I'm.
move on with her life.
The determination of a cap, if you do a cap, how much that cap is, how you determine it, those are all policy choices.
True, I'm just asking if that impacts the cap. You see if you take it to the next thought.
That would be a policy choice.
What you're saying, okay. Yeah.
Because if you have a cap, because you don't want to spend more than however many cents, but then you find out that the sticks and bricks is actually bringing in enough revenue to make that less than that cent cap, then you could adjust that cap upward because there's really more room.
Yeah, I feel like I need to
I think that-
I'm thinking on spreadsheets. I think I need to actually do a spreadsheet and send it to you and say, does this make sense? Because I'm having trouble articulating it.
Let's do that, because that might be the policy leap that I think maybe that assumption is the policy leap that justifies doing this at all, whether it's with a cap or not, but we have to do that. Do you have a question for Julia?
I do.
Great, please ask it. Thank you. No, it's fine. Don't apologize. I just want to make sure that we're,
Julia, I
Using everyone's
need to
time
ask something, and I want to know if you agree with a statement that the governor told me this morning. So
we are on the record and you are putting.
I just want to make sure that we're headed down the right road here, because for the last 2 months, I've been fighting for the ed fund, right? So I'm letting up because this morning he told me that he thought that many or all of the other programs that were initiated this year about housing were probably going to fall through, except for CHIP. And so if we implement CHIP, we get the payback to the ed fund starts in 5 years and then finishes in 10 years. Are you confident that's really gonna happen? At least those are the last dates I read. Maybe that's changed. If they have, I need to know that. But so the payback in 5 and 10, or maybe 25, whatever the heck it is, do you think that payback is really gonna happen to the ed fund to make it whole again at some point in the future?
I would defer to the answer.
If you don't know, you can just tell me. I don't know, Fallon.
I'm gonna say no comment.
She's a
Does that mean no?
She said no comment, Carolyn. Thank you.
Does that mean no?
It means no comment.
It means I'm not answering.
But it is 25 years that we're talking about. It's 20 to 25 years that we're talking about. The debt retention period is 20 years.
But then I'll be.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you for that closing remark, Representative Brannigan. Okay. We are, hi, over here. We are gonna take a quick break, 15-minute break. We have a 30-minute break scheduled. When we get back, I want us to there's sort of the question of where we want to put, I just want to sort of refresh the questions that are floating around. We have the question of whether we're going to put a cap. I heard some coalescing around the 1 cent idea, but I'm not sure about that. There is, if we do put a cap, how we are ensuring that there is geographic equity. And I think that's a really, whether people want a cap or not, I'd like people to reckon with that question. There are some more policy tweak things that I didn't hear people really arguing with each other about particularly that got thrown on the table. So just sort of think about that. I also just want to flag, so I mentioned that there was this group that met regularly to review housing proposals sort of early on. That group does not meet anymore. I think it's fascinating that there seems to be no standing body of housing experts, given that we are in the biggest housing crisis of the state, and everyone has come in and said this is the #1 concern of our time, that there does seem to be no regular meeting of all the folks who do housing around the state. So that's sort of fascinating, and I wanted that to, I'm just dropping that on the table to sit with us for a minute and see how that might fit into the chipboard idea or not chipboard idea.
Appropriations too.
Yeah. Thank you. And with that, we're gonna take a break.
Can you repeat? It's 15 minutes and then we come back.
15 minutes, we come back at 11 o'clock. We are actually picking up S633 and S109 for a little